Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, a big thank you to everybody that watched last week's episode of the show, liked, commented, all that kind of stuff. Yes, seems like you guys really enjoyed the Woodrose episode of the show last week, which was really, really nice. I think it had the most views in the first few hours of it being posted on YouTube, so that was pretty cool. Big thank you also to the viewer whose name unfortunately eludes me, Richard I think it was, that purchased a couple of bottles from Gauntleys. Obviously, as you know, the show has no direct link to Gauntleys. It used to have, obviously, but now it is just my show. But obviously, you can put two and two together. But of course, obviously, anything that I say in the show is obviously my own opinions and views, and has obviously nothing to do with with work, as they say. But anyway, just thought I'd make that clear, just in case. You never know. Nobody's complained about an episode of the show for quite a number of years now, which is pretty good. So hopefully I'll continue to keep everybody happy, because then if everybody's happy, then I'm happy, and well, you know, everybody's happy, and we're all happy bunnies. And God, I'm talking bollocks. Right, okay, let's talk whiskey. Right, so this week's episode of the show, I fancied doing something a little bit different to what I've been doing of late, and I felt like I need some peat. Now, I know a lot of people really don't drink peated malts during the summer. You know, it's that kind of, well, you know, they're associated with winter and sitting by a fire and all that kind of stuff, which, yep, I can't argue with that sort of simile. And conversely, you know, they say you should drink sort of like lighter lowland Speyside, that kind of stuff during the summer. Well, no, sometimes I just want a bit of peat, and you know, there's a lot of you guys out there that feel exactly the same way. So, summer peat episode of the show. Now, of course, I've got a number of samples in front of me here, which I've picked up over the years, apart from the old Balantruan, which came from Angus Dundee, so thank you for that, and the Ardbeg Cask Strength, which came from my good friend Giles Murray. Almost forgot your name there, Giles, sorry about that. Anyway, so the other ones I've kind of picked up over time, and they've been hanging around, and I've been thinking about doing something with them, so I thought today I would do an episode of the show on peated malts. Now, as you know, the peat is a natural product. Okay, it's created by the decomposition of whatever is in the locale. Now, a lot of people don't really think about peat, and they don't think about generally where the flavours in the whiskey come from, which is fine. I got no issue with that. You know, a lot of people just like the taste of whiskey. They like the taste of whiskey from certain distilleries, and that's as far as they want to take it, which is absolutely fine. Got no problem with that whatsoever. But for some of us, we want to know a little bit more. We want to know, you know, the ins and outs of a duck's dewberry at the end of the day, technical term. And peat is one of these really intriguing things, I suppose, for want of a better word. There is actually in Scotland, I believe, around about 24 licensed peat bogs. Now, only as far as I'm aware, 6, I believe, are in actual use at the moment. And I guess this is the thing with peat bogs. Obviously, it takes hundreds of years for these peat bogs to develop, and certainly this is a kind of a hot potato at the moment with sustainability and global warming and so on and so forth, and the fact that sort of peat bogs tend to capture carbon. They're now being more intensely managed, so I guess that there's a bit of a turnover. You know, there's a point where whoever are looking after the individual peat bog decide that it's time to move on and stop cutting peat from there and all that kind of thing. So as far as I'm aware, there are 6 that are in use. 3 are on Isla, Glen Macri, Gartbreck and Castle Hill. 1 is on Orkney at Hobster Hill, and 2 are on the mainland. 1 is in Aberdeen, called St Fergus, and the other one is called Macri Manish, which is in Campbelltown. So I've got a selection of peated malts in front of me, I could have, maybe I should have put in a Campbelltown and what have you, but anyway I haven't. So we're just going to look at them, A, from a point of view of what do they taste like, are they nice whiskies, and B, where do they get their peat from? Does that peat have a big bearing on the style of the whiskey? I mean, like I said, peat is made up of whatever is growing in the locale, so your Islers tend to sort of like will be more, you know, vegetation that's grown on Islay, seaweed, things like that, whereas the mainland bogs and fens and things like that are going to be comprised of more grasses, rushes, mosses and things like that. So obviously the composition of the peat will have an effect on the flavour, but how much, and then how much is it sort of like, you know, distillery character, distillation, so on and so forth. But anyway, without getting sort of like too technical, because I'm not a botanist and I'm not a scientist, I just taste whiskey, but we will look at the individual locations of, you know, where these distilleries get their peat from as I introduce the lineup. So I think it's time to do that. Right, okay, so as in most things with the whisky industry, there is an element of secrecy. Distilleries, distillery owners really don't like to sort of let on where they get their stuff from, how they do their stuff. You know, it's kind of, you know, because somebody's going to steal it. It's not fucking rocket science at the end of the day, you know, and I'm all for more sort of transparency in the whisky industry, and I think a lot of people are as well. Anyway, we're going to kick off with the Laphroaig Oak Select, bottled at 40%, unfortunately, but it is an entry-level bottling. Now, as far as I'm aware, this is a bottling that's been matured in an absolute plethora of different casks, including sherry butts, American oak, PX, seasoned hoggies, quarter casks and first fill bourbon. I.e. it's basically all the stuff that they're not using for any of the other bottlings that they've just chucked together in a big marrying tank. Oh, am I being a little bit... Anyway, I love Laphroaig, okay, so, you know, but there is, you know, I mean, although they're not Diageo, there is an element of, yeah, commercialism about sort of, you know, the owners of Laphroaig. Anyway, coming back to the peat, as far as I'm aware, Laphroaig is the only distillery that sources its peat from the Glen Macquarie moss, which is a basin bog apparently, and basin bogs are otherwise known as fens, and fens tend to have sort of more sedges, grasses, rushes, that kind of thing. So that should be quite interesting. Next bottle we'll be looking at is Old Balantruan 10-year-old, bottled at 50%. So Old Balantruan is the peated malt produced at the Tomintoul distillery. Now, according to Robert Fleming, when I spoke to him many years ago when I was writing an article on peat, when they first started making a peated malt at Tomintoul back in the early 2000s, I think it was 2000, 2001, something like that, they were sourcing peat from the Tomintoul bog. No, that's not the toilet. There was, or is still probably a peat bog called Tomintoul, but that closed down, and I don't know exactly when, but now they are sourcing their peat from the St Fergus peat bog in Aberdeen, which apparently is a blanket bog, which is slightly different to a basin bog, and in that it doesn't tend to have a lot of carbohydrate. It's more mossy, and there's less of the sort of like the carbohydrates that I would imagine sort of create a lot of the smoke. But of course, obviously, like I said, I'm not a sort of an expert on peat. Third whisky we've been looking at is the newest distillery to start production on Islay. This is Ardnahoe. This is their Bholsa bottling, again bottled at 50%. I believe this bottling came from June of 2025, and it's just matured in a combination of American oak and a fair amount of Oloroso sherry. Now, they get their peat from, or they get their malt, I should say, from the Port Ellen maltings. Now, Port Ellen gets their peat from the Castle Hill peat bog, which again is a blanket bog, and that supplies, obviously, a lot of the distilleries on Isle obviously get their malt from Port Ellen, so therefore pretty much all the rest of the distilleries are going to get their peat from exactly the same place. So, you know, how does that? Why do their spirits taste, or their peat taste, slightly different? Very good question. Anyway, I'm going to move on to the fourth bottling. So this is the brand spanking new 10-year-old Cask Strength bottling from Ardbeg, bottled at 61.7. Oof, they don't muck about, do they? So all aged in bourbon, which is I'm quite happy about. And now Ardbeg, apparently, historically, they actually had their own peat bog called Kintor Peat Bog, or Kintor Peat Moss, I believe it was called. I think they no longer take peat from that peat bog, and so therefore their malt now comes from the Port Ellen maltings, which is therefore Castle Hill Peat Bog. Moving on to Kilchoman, so this is the 13-year-old, 50% ABV from ex-bourbon barrels, octaves and Calvados casks, so kind of quite interested to taste that. This is batch number 25/17. Now, Kilchoman is slightly different to a lot of the other distilleries in that it sources most of its malt comes from the mainland, so I'm guessing that their peat comes from the St Fergus peat bog in Aberdeenshire, which is where the old Balantruan's peat comes from. So it'll be interesting to see if there's more of an old Balantruan-y character, or whether it's more of an Islay character. Now that's going to be interesting, because then that will say, well, you know, maybe the peat only plays a fairly small part in the flavour profile of peated malts. So we shall see. This is getting quite cool, I think, you know. So you know, this is you learn stuff on this channel, I hasten to add. Anyway, and then the final bottling of the day is a Lagavulin. It has to be a Lagavulin. I have to shoehorn one of those in. And this is a new bottling, or recent bottling, of the Distillers edition. Now, in the past, the Distillers editions always used to carry a distillation date and a bottling date, so you could figure out how old the bottling was, and more or less tended to be around about 16%. So this is the new bottling, which doesn't carry either, which kind of makes you think, well, it's obviously got to have younger spirit in, hasn't it? So is this kind of like, you know, Diageo kind of screwing us over? I mean, you know, the Distillers edition is, you know, stupidly expensive, and now it's no longer a 16-year-old, you know, so, you know, is it worth it? But, of course, as we know, the Distillers edition is heavily sherry influenced, and, well, caramel influenced as well, because we know that sort of Diageo tend to go heavy-handed with the E150, so never been a bottling I've been the biggest fan of, but anyway, you know, I thought, well, I've got a sample of it, so let's stick it in the lineup. So there you go. So that's this week's lineup. I think this is going to be really intriguing. So let's kick off with a bit of Laphroaig then. Right, okay, so let's start off with the Oak Select. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Quite young, briny, quite phenolic. It has the classic medicinal note. So obviously one assumes that the Glen Macri bog tends to have vegetation that gives it this kind of medicinal note. Now I always thought that was seaweed, but it might not be. But anyway, it's got a little bit of lemon, a little bit of fruitiness, a bit of earth. There's oak character. It's a little bit homogeneous oak. I mean, yes, there's a little bit of dried fruit. There's some vanilla, but it's not really. It's kind of, I suppose, because there's so much oak there, it's all kind of, to a certain extent, cancelled itself out, shall we say. Anyway, let's see what passes on. Youthful, salty, briny, citric, not hugely peated. It has that medicinal peat note, not as much peat as you would expect, but I think that's probably down to all the oak. And again, like the palate, it doesn't really have a specific oak characteristic. It just tastes of oak. It's also a little bit lacking in the finish. I mean, that's 40% for you. I mean, yeah, it's okay. I mean, it's you may as well just go for the 10-year-old. I forget what this retails for, but it's you know, it's okay. You know, it's a sort of, like I said, I mean, although there's not a lot of oak flavour per se in an individual note. I mean, you know, if you didn't know it was made up of all these different types of cask, you wouldn't have guessed it from the palate. So it's all right at the end of the day. Okay, so let's move on to the old Balantruan 10-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this one, shall we? Now that's more like it. That's got some intensity. I mean, yes, it is 50%. It's got a lovely earthy, sort of mossy, almost medicinal peat. It's kind of mentholy kind of peat. Heather, scrub, dark honey, vanilla, fleshy fruits. You know, this has real depth to it. I mean, all right, it's kind of coming after a no-age statement young Frankenstein sort of malt, so it is kind of showing sort of really well. But you know, this is it. A lot of people kind of just really don't think about old Balantruan. They don't think about Tomintoul making peated malt, because obviously Tomintoul, the old Balantruan is labelled as old Balantruan rather than Tomintoul. And a lot of people just don't think about it. You know, they think about the Islers, they think about Laphroaig and Ardbeg and so on. But this has got some real guts to it. And what I love about this is that obviously Tomintoul's spirit has some lovely weight to it, has a nice honeyed kind of character, and it works really well with the peat. Let's see what pass on. Full, honeyed, rich, earthy, lovely earthy peat character. Not so much of that medicinal or menthol, I should say, rather than medicinal note. Again, it's got that heathery, that decomposed heather, and a little bit of a mossiness and some sort of decomposed grass kind of notes. But again, it's got that lovely weight and fullness, and a touch of honey. And I mean, that is a fabulous whiskey, it has to be said. Doesn't really need any water. I'm just going to put a little bit with it, just out of complete curiosity to see how it handles it. More distillery character now. Well, it's got more of a sort of a kind of like a Speyside-y character. I'm getting a little bit of green fruit and almost kind of agave kind of green, slightly astringent fruit. Quite oily now. A little less honey, a little less peat, but there's still noticeable amounts of. Sort of pass on now. It's got a burnt kind of earth kind of note on the finish, sort of burnt peat, I suppose. It's got a little bit more citrus, but it's also still quite weighty. Doesn't quite have the sort of like the oomph. I love it at 50%. I don't really think that it needed to put any water with it. It was just out of curiosity. It really does make it feel oily and weighty. Not quite got the sort of like the spey green fruit on the palate that I did on the nose, but you know, either way, I mean, you know, that's a fabulous whiskey, it has to be said. Okay, so let's move on to the Ardnahoe Bholsa. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Now that's a lovely nose, fresh and briny, but juicy and fruity and weighty. Now I believe that they kind of went against the grain to a certain extent when they built the distillery. Most distilleries these days, as you well know, tend to use shell and tube condensers. But I believe that they built them with good old-fashioned worm tubs, which gives you that kind of meaty, sulphurous kind of style of new make, which gives it a quite nice weight with a little bit of age. So now I don't think this is particularly old. I mean, certain distilleries that use worm tubs, like Dalwhinnie for example, and kind of Mortlach, they need to leave their spirit in oak for quite some considerable time to get rid of the sulphur. This has got quite a savoury note and a richness. There's a little bit of dusty peat, some rock pools, some iodine. Now again, like I said, Ardnahoe gets its malt from the Port Ellen malting, so again that will be Castle Hill peat. But it's got, again, it's kind of, yes, the peat character is there, but it's sort of slightly softer. And that is again down to the style of the spirit, softening the peat character. It doesn't have the medicinal character that the Laphroaig has, obviously. Doesn't have quite the earthiness of old Balantruan. An actual fact, and you may well be saying, well, you haven't actually mentioned sherry, considering this is predominantly sherry. Well, they must be using pretty well used casks, but because there's a little bit there, a little bit of dried fruit, but you know, not as much as I was expecting. I mean, I was expecting a bit of a peat sherry monster, but the balance on this is fab, absolutely fabulous. Super pass one. Again, quite a weighty palate, a bit more sherry character, more of the Oloroso dried fruit, dusty peat, tar, a little bit of bog myrtle, drier, earthier peat in actual fact coming through on the palate, but again wrapped up in this lovely weighty, malty, almost honeyed spirit character. A little bit of salt, some spices, wood spices coming through on the finish. Again, it's got that lovely kind of nip to it. Again, I don't think it really needs any water whatsoever. I mean, it's pretty much fine at 50%. Now that's bringing out more kind of white fruits, almost estery white fruits. Shows that the distillery character is a lovely fruity style. Don't know what the fermentation time is, but I would guess, smelling this, probably fairly long. Probably 90 odd hours maybe, I would guess, because it's got a lovely fruitiness to it. Anyway, let's sort of pass on now. Less peat, which is often what happens when you put water with peat in malts, and peat does kind of start to sort of slunk off a bit. More fruit, more honey, a little bit more of an astringent saltiness coming through now, and a lot less sherry. Not that there was a great deal to start off with, so you're getting all that lovely kind of weighty distillery character, the saltiness, the sort of like, you know, that kind of elements as well. Peat is still quite dry, but again it has that sort of lightly sort of herbal characteristic. So yeah, if you've not had an Ardnahoe as yet, definitely worth picking one up, I think. Right, okay, so let's move on to the Ardbeg. Now, one thing I haven't mentioned is obviously the parts per million, the level that the malt is peated to. Now, as far as I'm aware, both Ardbeg and Ardnahoe tend to sort of peat to roughly about the same kind of level, 40 odd parts per million, I believe. Anyway, let's see what the Ardbeg gives us. Oh, that's kind of Ardbeg on steroids. Dry peat again, dusty peat, bog myrtle, vanilla, lemon, beeswax, iodine, toffee, vanilla. Oh, that's a lovely nose, it has to be said. Now, again, Ardbeg, I remember when sort of like, you know, Glenmorangie kind of like relaunched Ardbeg, and a lot of people were saying, well, it ain't like it used to be, they've upped the peating levels, yada, 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 and I thought, yeah, well, they've made it a bloody better spirit as well, a lot cleaner. Nowadays, nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about sort of like, you know, past bottlings. You know, at one point they used to rave about, what was it, the 16, was it? You know, God, never got on with that bottling at all. Always too heavy, always too oily for its own good. Not enough peat. It was just a bit of a kind of, Now, if you want to find a bottle like that, you'll probably be paying through the nose for it. But anyway, so coming back to this is, yeah, 10-year-old on steroids. This is really intense. You can almost smell that barley. It's kind of just so precise and intense, and that's what I love about cask strength whiskies. You know, they just have that intensity, and I guess that, you know, to a certain extent, I've tasted far too many that my palate is kind of a bit a bit ruined when it comes to sort of stuff bottled at 40% nowadays. So maybe it's me. Anyway, that's sort of pass on. Earthy, sooty, really peaty. Has that kind of boonery kind of green pepper, salt, citrus, bog myrtle, touch of vanilla. Even though that's 60-odd%, and the finish is masked a little bit, it's not hot. I mean, you can taste that it's obviously over 50% ABV. But it has a lovely lift to it, a lovely citric character. And again, this is, you know, we're talking sort of like, you know, same, probably the same peat sauce as the Ardnahoe, but a completely different character, you know, and it goes to show that sort of like, you know, that obviously peat is an important part of a peated malt, obviously, but it's only a small part of the overall makeup of that whiskey, and it shows that the distillery's character, i.e. how the distillery sort of like ferments and distills and all that kind of stuff, is still the most important part of the flavour profile of a whiskey. And this is why I keep banging on about why I want to taste whiskies that have just been aged in American oak, because I want the distillery to tell me something about a spirit. I don't want it just to be sort of like, oh no, there's another sherry cask, or oh my god, it just tastes of wine. You know, to me that's not interesting. I mean, yes, you can divorce yourself from that and look at it as purely in a flavour aesthetics, which some people do, and you can, and I do put whiskies on the shelf like that I don't think are particularly interesting, but they have a flavour aesthetic that's kind of interesting, if you follow what I'm talking about. Anyway, right, so water brings out a little bit more of the oiliness. It's more spirit orientated, but it's still got that lovely kind of fresh lemon and saltiness. I always get lemon with Ardbeg, I don't know why, just do. Again, like most peated malts, the peat is dialed down a little bit now. I put a little drop of water with it, and there's a little bit more toffied oak as well. It's still more intense than your bog standard, your bog standard Ardbeg, or Ardbeg 10-year-old, but still really intense. I like it. Anyway, palate. Sweeter, oilier, more oak. So dialing down the intensity of the alcohol has brought forward and brought in the oak character. It's more rounded. There's more vanilla. It's softer. There's the peat is still there. Actually, it's still quite a lot of noticeable peat, very sooty peat, which it seems to be an Ardbeg characteristic again. That is a fabulous whisky. If you can get hold of it, then absolutely get hold of a bottle, because you know that really is kind of, like I said, Ardbeg 10 on steroids. Okay, so let's move on to the Kilchoman 13-year-old. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? Ooh, that's a lovely nose. That's got a real freshness and a lot of Calvados. Fresh apple, Calvados apple, sweet and oily barley. The peat is actually playing second fiddle here to the Calvados, which some people are probably going to sort of go, no, too much Calvados. And yeah, it's got a lovely sweetness, it's got plenty of that. There's enough peat there. There's a little bit of a medicinal note, but no, it's more menthol than medicinal. Again, we are kind of in a sort of style like the old Balantruan. It has that dry, earthy peat with a mentholy kind of note coming through as well. A little bit of salt, so you know it is saying Islay, and this is the thing, isn't it? You know, it's kind of like we don't want all of the Islay distilleries to be just carbon copies of each other, and well, frankly, they're not. It's never going to be, but certainly, you know, I love what Kilchoman. I've always loved Kilchoman. It has to be said. So pass on. Fresh, crisp, green apple, Calvados apple, green spice, quite tight, I mean it is, no, it's only 50%, I thought it was cask strength. Really briny and almost medicinal peat, which is quite a surprise given that it is actually from the mainland. Got dry barley husks, salty, really incredibly salty. I mean, it's just so salty. So it's kind of Calvados apples and salt and brine. I mean, that is intense. I mean, that is wonderfully intense. We'll put a little drop of water. Again, it doesn't really need it at all. I mean, I just love that intensity. 50% ABV for me is absolutely fine. Once you start creeping above 50%, then yeah, maybe a little drop of water is required. It's a little bit overly oily now. I mean, this is the problem when you sort of dilute whiskey, is that it does tend to emphasize the natural oils, which is good in a way, but bad in a way, because they tend to sort of blanket things, if you like, a bit like a blanket bog. Oh dear. Quite fruity, a little bit of almost kind of crushed banana. See what the power's like. Again, fuller, oilier, richer, drier peat. Certainly it's showing kind of like a distinct simile to the old Balantruan, with that sort of dry, earthy, soily kind of peat, as opposed to the sort of Laphroaig medicinal peat. I think I prefer that without water. I think that works without water. It doesn't need it. I just put a little drop of water to see what happens, because you know sometimes whiskies kind of fall apart when you put a little drop of water with it. This hasn't. This has become more oilier, which is kind of, to a certain extent, sort of, you know, made it not quite so sort of complex and intense. So, but either way, again, another fantastic Kilchoman bottling, and I don't think I've ever tasted a poor bottling from Kilchoman, so yeah. Right, okay, so finally a bit of peat and sherry. Let's see what the nose gives us on this then, shall we? Actually, it's not as much sherry as previous bottlings. I mean, I remember that the bottlings that used to have a distillation date and a bottling date were a complete wash with kind of PX and all that kind of stuff. And obviously it doesn't smell as old. I mean, there's a youthful element there, which in the Lagavulin 8-year-old is absolutely fine. But like when I say, when you're being fleeced for 3 figures, you know, you want age. You know, you don't want to pay kind of like, you know, 3 figures for something that isn't as old as what it used to be. It's quite herbal. There's some stinky sort of cow patty kind of peat going on. Sweet dried fruits, earth, salt. Again, it's obviously from the Port Ellen maltings, but the sherry character is kind of like overwhelming the peat to a certain extent, even though it's not as heavily sherried as some bottlings in the Distillers edition. Let's see what the palate's like. Lots of treacles, sweet sherry. The peat is quite hidden, although it comes through a little bit on the finish with a sort of like an earthy, mentholy kind of note, a little bit of coffee, dark chocolate. Again, it doesn't feel as old because obviously it's not as old as what it used to be. There's a youthful element there. Nice saltiness on the finish and oiliness, but I can feel on my tongue, and it's got to be the caramel. I mean, you know, I know that sort of Diageo claim that the caramel has no bearing on the flavour or anything, but we all know that that's complete horse, because it definitely does. And it's kind of, I'm feeling it, you know. So it's okay. I mean, it's never going to be one that really sort of like, you know, blows me up, as they say. So let's sum today's episode of the show. Well, personally, I think it's been sort of really, really intriguing. I mean, I've loved it. You know, bit of peat on a summer's day, although it's not exactly summery or hot, incredibly hot, but it's at least it's dry, which is one good thing, I suppose, here in Nottingham. Anyway, so the Laphroaig Oak Select, well, it is what it is. It's an entry-level Laphroaig. It's kind of leftovers, isn't it? It's kind of a bit like, you know, I was going to say sloppy seconds. Oh, shouldn't say that. It's pretty homogeneous. You know, there's no real standout oak character. It's just kind of like, yeah, sloppy seconds, it has to be said. The old Balantruan 10 is absolutely gorgeous. Love that. Love the intensity of it. Love the richness and the sort of like the sweetness and the fruitiness. And it works so well with the peat. It's just, yeah, like I said, a lot of people just really don't think about old Balantruan, and they certainly should. Ardnahoe, in a very short time, they have certainly carved out a definite sort of fan base, I think. What I've tasted so far from the distillery, I've really, really liked. And again, like I said, it certainly had the peated character, but it had a real warmth and a richness, and I'm guessing a lot of that coming down to the sort of the worm tubs. Ardbeg 10-year-old, yeah, 10-year-old on steroids. Loved it. I mean, I've been a big fan of Ardbeg for a long, long time. And that certainly was a fabulous bottling. Like I said, a lot of people are turned off by Ardbeg because of the association and all the marketing gumph and all the kind of like hype and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes that kind of obscures everything, which is a bit of a shame, because at the end of the day, Ardbeg's spirit is still bloody good. And Kilchoman, love Kilchoman. Again, the quality of what they're doing is really intriguing. And again, in this tasting, you can see the correlation between it and old Balantruan in that kind of slightly more mainland earthy sort of vegetal kind of peat character, as opposed to the sort of medicinal character of Laphroaig and the characters of the other Islet whiskies. And the Lagavulin Distillers edition. Well, like I said, I mean, you know, you kind of know what you're kind of going to get with the Distillers edition, although it probably wasn't as heavily peated, heavily sherried as I remember. Again, like I said, if you're going to do Lagavulin, you may as well just do the 8-year-old. It's younger, yes, I know, but you get all of the lovely character of the spirit and no bloody sherry, which is really good. And, you know, Diageo are never going to change their ways. You know, Diageo are a bloody elephant, aren't they? Really, they're a bloody mammoth. Really, you know, they are so sort of welded to, you know, the use of caramel and sort of 40% and all that kind of stuff, which is a real shame. But anyway, you know, that we'll bang on about that, but they don't really care at the end of the day, do they? It's all about their share prices, which seem to be tanking. But anyway, so no less about that. Anyway, I really thought this week's episode of the show was really intriguing. All I can say is good dramming and good afternoon, because I'm about to run out of time.
It'll never come in a message you'll never get. I'll send you all my grief and pain I cannot forget. Built up just to break it down.